I stood at the edge of my cornfield, the early light spilling across the rows of green, and stared at the fresh tire tracks slicing through the middle of my crops. Deep grooves, mud thrown in every direction, corn stalks flattened like someone had plowed through with no care in the world. It wasn't the first time. It was the fourth time that week. And every single time, the same set of tracks, wide, clean and unmistakably from a luxury SUV. A white Escalade, the kind of car that looks out of place anywhere near a farm. I didn't need to guess who it was. Everyone around here knew who it was. Her name was Victoria Payton, the treasurer of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, the kind of person who treated every conversation like a meeting she was chairing. She wasn't just entitled, she was legendary for it. People said she fined her own neighbors for leaving their garbage cans out too long. She was the HOA's self-proclaimed queen, and her crown was her Escalade. I'd seen her drive it around town, spotless, white, and always cutting corners, literally and metaphorically. And now those same tires were cutting across my property, turning my cornfield into her personal shortcut to the highway. She said it saved her 5 minutes. 5 minutes that were apparently worth destroying hundreds of dollars worth of crops. I could almost hear her voice in my head. That perfectly condescending tone she used whenever she spoke to anyone she considered beneath her. The first time I found the tracks, I thought it might have been kids joyriding. The second time I realized it wasn't. The third time I made sure I was standing at the edge of the field the next morning, waiting. And the fourth time, I knew this was going to become a war. My name's Marcus Chen, and I own 80 acres of farmland that sits just outside of Meadowbrook's borders. I bought it precisely because it was outside of any HOA's reach. No rules, no nonsense, just open land, hard work and peace. But peace doesn't last long when someone like Victoria Payton decides your property is her personal driveway. By the time this story was over, she'd be standing in the middle of my field with 4 flat tires, screaming about lawsuits and her rights, while her husband, the HOA president, tried to save her from the fallout. But right then, that morning, I didn't know any of that. I just knew I was angry, and that I wasn't about to let someone roll over me or my land without a fight. 3 years earlier, I'd been a city man. I spent my days under fluorescent lights and my nights staring at spreadsheets. 25 years of managing supply chains, production schedules, and endless meetings had burned me out to the bone. One day I looked at my reflection in a glass office door and realized I didn't recognize the man staring back. That's when I started planning my escape. I'd always dreamed of owning land, working it with my hands instead of a keyboard, so I started saving every extra dollar. When this property went up for sale, 80 acres in rural Nebraska with its own creek, old farmhouse, and more peace than I'd ever had, I didn't hesitate. I bought it in cash and never looked back. From the first morning, I knew I'd made the right choice. The air smelled clean. The only noise was the wind and the occasional lowing of cattle. I started small, 20 head of Angus, a modest crop of corn and soybeans, and a barn I rebuilt board by board. My driveway stretched half a mile to County Road 47, all gravel that I graded myself. Beyond my western fence line sat Meadowbrook Estates, a sprawling cluster of luxury homes behind their gates and HOA rules. You could see their manicured lawns from my hilltop, green even in drought, watered daily by automatic sprinklers. At first, I thought we'd coexist peacefully. I kept to my side, they kept to theirs. I even waved a few times when I passed one of them on the road. But there's something about people who live under HOA power that makes some of them believe they're above the rest of the world. It wasn't long before I heard stories from my southern neighbor, Dale, how Victoria and her husband, Richard, fined residents for planting the wrong flowers, threatened to sue over mailbox paint, and bragged about protecting the neighborhood's image. They were the kind of couple who believed a title on a board made them royalty. It started about 6 months after I moved in. One morning, while checking on my cattle, I heard the sound of an engine, loud, expensive, and completely out of place. I I turned and saw a white Escalade bouncing across my cornfield, kicking up dirt like it was running from the law. I stood there frozen as it barreled through my land, flattening young stalks before disappearing behind the trees toward Meadowbrook's back gate. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. My first thought was that someone had made a mistake, maybe lost, maybe trying to avoid something. I wasn't angry, just shocked. 2 days later it happened again. Same time, same sound. The Escalade came from the same direction and tore through the same section of field. This time I tried to flag it down, but the driver didn't stop. I caught a glimpse of her, oversized sunglasses, blonde hair, and a posture that screamed arrogance. The next day, I moved my truck to the field's edge and waited. Sure enough, around 7:15 in the morning, I saw her coming. I pulled out onto the dirt path just as she approached, blocking her route. The Escalade skidded to a stop, mud splattering her perfect paint job. She rolled down her window with a sigh, as if I were the inconvenience. "Excuse me," she said. "You're blocking the road." "This isn't a road," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's private property." She tilted her sunglasses down just enough for me to see her eyes, cold and dismissive. "Oh, sweetie, there's an easement here," she said with a little laugh. "It's been here for decades. You really should check your county records." I blinked. "An easement?" "Yes," she said, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. "My husband is the HOA president, and we've always had the right to use this path. You're new here, so you wouldn't understand." Then, without waiting for another word, she slipped her sunglasses back up, turned her wheel, and drove around my truck, straight through another section of corn. I stood there, speechless. I'd been disrespected before, but never like that. I called my lawyer that afternoon, a local man named Jim Sutton, who'd handled my property purchase. I told him everything and asked him to verify her claim. 2 days later, he called back. "Marcus," he said, "there's no easement, no shared access, no rights of way. Your title is clean. She's trespassing, period." Armed with that, I thought it'd be simple. Tell her again, show her proof, and she'd stop. But if you've ever dealt with someone entitled enough to believe they own the world, you know logic doesn't work. Victoria didn't stop. If anything, she doubled down. Every morning and every evening, she'd drive the same route, tires cutting through my crops like clockwork. I started taking pictures, the time, the tracks, the damage. I put up bright red private property, no trespassing signs every 20 feet. She ignored them all. My neighbor Dale said he'd seen her too and offered to testify if it came to that. "You're dealing with the Paytons," he told me. "They think the law's a suggestion." For a while I tried to let it go. I thought maybe she'd get bored or embarrassed, but it only got worse. The noise from her SUV started spooking my cattle. I had 3 pregnant cows ready to calve that spring, and every time her engine roared by, they'd bolt in panic. I couldn't take it anymore. I drafted a cease and desist letter with Jim's help, sent it by certified mail so she'd have to sign for it. 3 days later, I was in the barn working when I heard her engine again. I ran outside just in time to see her slow down, rip open the letter, glance at it, and toss it out her window before flooring it through the mud. Papers fluttered across the ground like confetti. That was the moment something in me shifted. I'd tried polite. I'd tried legal. But it was clear she wasn't going to stop, not until I made her. I didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a battle that would test every ounce of my patience and every bit of my belief in the system. I wasn't going to fight dirty. I was going to fight smart. And when I finally did, I'd make sure that every move was by the book, because if there's one thing people like Victoria never expect, it's for the person they underestimate to play the long game. I spent that night sitting at my kitchen table, the cease and desist letter still fresh in my mind, the image of Victoria tossing it out her window, replaying like a bad movie. I'd done everything right. I'd called my lawyer, checked the records, documented every trespass. Still, she acted as if laws didn't apply to her. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. Tired of seeing my crops crushed. Tired of chasing someone who thought she was above the rules. I knew I couldn't let it go on, but I also knew one wrong move could ruin me. Out here, you learn that you can't win against people like Victoria by shouting louder. You win by being smarter, calmer, and one step ahead. The next morning, I drove into town and met with Jim, my lawyer. He looked up from his desk when I walked in, already guessing why I was there. "She's still at it, isn't she?" he asked. I nodded. He sighed. "Marcus, there's no question she's in the wrong. But the system moves slow. You could take her to civil court, sure, but we're talking months, maybe over a year. Legal fees alone could run you 30 grand. I rubbed my temples. "So you're saying she gets to keep doing this?" Jim leaned back in his chair. "Not forever. But unless we catch her red-handed, and she refuses to leave when ordered, the sheriff can't do much. What we can do is make sure you're fully protected. Documentation, reports, photos, keep collecting them." I did exactly that. Every morning I checked for new tracks. Every evening I logged times and took photos. I even bought a trail camera with night vision and mounted it on a tree overlooking her route. What I saw made my blood boil. Twice a day, like clockwork, her Escalade tore through the same strip of field. Sometimes she'd even honk her horn for fun, just to spook my cattle. It wasn't about convenience anymore. It was about power. She knew she was upsetting me, and she loved it. The damage got worse each week. My corn was shredded, my soil compacted from the weight of her SUV, and then came the moment that pushed me over the edge. It was early March, still cold enough that the mornings bit at your fingers. Daisy, one of my oldest cows, was close to calving. She'd been restless for days, and I was keeping an eye on her from the barn when I heard that all-too-familiar roar of Victoria's engine. I stepped outside, waving my arms, shouting for her to stop. Instead, she sped up and laid on her horn, the blaring sound echoing through the field. Daisy panicked, bolted across the pasture, and went down hard. I ran to her, heart pounding, but it was too late. The stress had made her miscarry. The calf was gone. I sat in the mud beside her, furious, helpless, and sick to my stomach. The vet confirmed what I already knew. "Stress-induced miscarriage," he said gently, handing me the report. "Whatever scared her, it hit her hard." I filed another report with the sheriff's office, attaching the vet's statement, the photos, the timestamps. I even called Deputy Morrison, the same officer who'd come out the first time. He was sympathetic but realistic. "I wish I could do more, Mr. Chen," he said. "But until we catch her in the act, my hands are tied." I thanked him and hung up, though every muscle in my body screamed for action. That night, I went back through every document I had, photos, reports, receipts, signed mail slips. I realized something. Victoria wasn't stupid. She knew how far she could push without crossing into immediate arrest territory. And she was using that knowledge to torment me. But there was one thing she didn't understand. While she relied on arrogance, I relied on preparation. And I was about to use that to my advantage. For 3 days, I researched everything I could about property protection laws. I read forums, legal cases, and farmer discussions. That's when I stumbled across the idea of spike strips. They were legal for police use, but what about private property? I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to stop her vehicle from destroying my land. When I met with Jim again, I asked him straight out, "Can I install spike strips on my property?" He paused, then said carefully, "That's a gray area. But if you provide clear warning signs and proof that she was informed, you'd have a strong defense. You're protecting your property, not ambushing anyone." That was all I needed to hear. I started planning every detail. I ordered retractable, law enforcement-grade spike strips, designed to puncture tires safely without flipping vehicles. I didn't want blood on my conscience. I just wanted peace. While waiting for the shipment, I made 30 large reflective signs that read, "Private property, vehicle deterrent devices in use. Proceeding will cause tire damage." I placed them every 50 feet along the route she always used. I took photos of each one with timestamps and GPS coordinates, then mailed her one final certified letter with everything enclosed, pictures, explanations, warnings. 3 days later, her HOA lawyer sent a letter threatening to sue me for harassment. I laughed out loud. I'd expected it. They claimed I was creating unsafe conditions on community property. I sent the response straight to Jim, who drafted a reply that dismantled every claim. We attached my property deed, proof of the signs, and copies of all previous warnings. "Let them come," Jim said over the phone. "You've got every document you need." On Sunday night, I stood at the edge of my property under a pale moon, the cold air biting at my hands as I bolted the last section of spike strips into place. 3 sets, each 10 feet long, spaced 30 yards apart. I'd tested them earlier on my old truck. Safe, controlled, effective. My cameras were armed, my lights adjusted, and every angle of the field was covered. I didn't sleep that night. I kept checking the monitors, sipping bitter coffee, waiting for morning. When dawn broke, I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. 6:45 a.m. came and went. Then 7:10. My cameras flickered with movement. There she was, the white Escalade shining in the sunlight, heading straight for my field. Even through the screen, I could see her sunglasses glint. She didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. The first warning sign passed by in a blur, then the second, then the third. 10 yards out, the front tires hit the first strip. The sound was sharp and unmistakable. Pop, pop. The Escalade jolted, dipped, but she kept driving, thinking she'd hit a pothole. 5 seconds later, the back tires met the same fate. More sharp bursts, more deflation. Her brake lights flashed, but momentum carried her forward, straight into the second strip. Metal scraped, tires shredded. Rubber flew like confetti. The Escalade dragged itself another 20 yards before the final strip sealed its fate. When it stopped, it sat dead center in my cornfield, 4 flats, rims bending under the weight. For a few seconds, she didn't move. The engine idled, smoke rising from the exhaust. Then her door opened, and out stepped Victoria Payton, fur coat, designer boots, phone already in hand. She stared at her car like she couldn't believe what she was seeing, then looked around as if the world had betrayed her. Her voice carried across the field, shrill and furious. "You'll pay for this, Marcus. You hear me? You'll pay." I stayed where I was, phone recording, every camera rolling. I called the sheriff's office, my voice steady. "This is Marcus Chen," I said. "I have an active trespasser on my property." She ignored multiple posted warnings and damaged her vehicle as a result. "Please send a deputy." When the patrol car finally pulled in 20 minutes later, Victoria had gone from rage to theatrics. She ran up to the deputy, waving her arms. "He tried to kill me," she shouted. "He set traps on public land. I could have died." I approached quietly, folder in hand. "Deputy," I said calmly, "this woman has been trespassing on my property for 6 months. She's ignored legal notices, destroyed my crops, and caused the loss of livestock. I have photos, signed mail receipts, and full video evidence. She was warned in writing about the spike strips." The deputy flipped through my folder, then turned to her. "Ma'am, do you have proof of this alleged easement?" Her lips tightened. "My husband does. He's the HOA president." "Do you have it with you?" he asked again. She stammered, "Not right now." The deputy sighed, looked at the torn-up field, then at me. "Mr. Chen, you've done everything right. Ma'am, I'm citing you for trespassing and property damage. You're lucky he warned you." Victoria's face went pale. "You can't do that," she snapped. "This is a civil matter." The deputy closed his notebook. "Not anymore." "Ma'am," she stood there, staring at me, as her perfect world started to collapse. 4 flat tires, a citation in her hand, and the realization that for once, her name and money couldn't save her. I didn't say a word. I just watched her drive away in the tow truck's shadow, the sound of deflated tires scraping across gravel echoing behind her. For the first time in months, my land was quiet again. But even as I stood there, surrounded by peace, I knew it wasn't over. People like Victoria don't quit when they're embarrassed. They double down. I had no idea that the spike strips were only the beginning, that what came next would destroy not just her car, but her entire life. 2 days went by without a sign of Victoria or her Escalade. The silence was unsettling. After 6 months of her tires crunching through my field twice a day, the quiet felt unreal. The cows grazed without fear again. The wind hummed through the corn, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. I figured she was licking her wounds, plotting her next move, or waiting for her husband and lawyers to find a way to twist the situation. I didn't have to wait long to find out which one it was. On the third morning, I opened my mailbox to find a thick envelope from a law firm in Omaha. Inside was a formal notice of intent to sue. According to the letter, I had willfully and maliciously damaged her vehicle and caused emotional distress amounting to $42,000. I laughed out loud right there at the mailbox. Emotional distress. The only distress here was the one she'd caused me. I drove straight into town and handed the letter to Jim. He read the first paragraph, smirked, and set it down. "This," he said, "is actually good news." I raised an eyebrow. "Good news?" He nodded. "It means she's out of legal ground. They're bluffing. When someone's on the defensive, they make wild claims like this, hoping to scare you into paying." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling. "So what do we do?" Jim's eyes glinted. "We go on offense. You've got 6 months of evidence, damage reports, witness statements, even video proof. We counterclaim for actual damages, property destruction, crop loss, livestock injury, and add punitive damages for willful trespassing." For the first time in months, I smiled. Jim went to work immediately. He built the case like an architect, careful, thorough, and methodical. We documented everything: the destroyed corn rows, the cost of feed lost due to compacted soil, the vet's bill for Daisy. The total came to about $28,000. Add in emotional damages and court costs, and we had a case that would hit her harder than any spike strip. We sent the counterclaim certified mail to both her personal lawyer and the HOA's legal team. And then, just like that, silence. A week passed. Then another. No response. No threats. No escalade. Then one evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, my neighbor Dale called. "Marcus, you sitting down?" he asked. "You're about to hear something wild." He went on to explain that Meadowbrook Estates was in chaos. Word had spread fast about Victoria's little incident. Apparently, someone from the tow company had talked, and the story made its way onto the local Facebook group. People started asking questions. Why was the HOA treasurer trespassing on a farmer's property? Why was she using HOA funds to pay her legal bills? That's when Patricia, the assistant treasurer, decided to dig deeper. What she found was worse than anyone imagined. Victoria had been embezzling from the HOA for 2 years. Small transactions at first, miscellaneous maintenance fees, vendor reimbursements, but they added up. Around $60,000 had quietly vanished into luxury shopping, spa visits, and personal lawyer payments. Patricia confronted the board, and when Richard, the HOA president and Victoria's husband, tried to shut her down, she went straight to the county auditor. Within a week, there was a full investigation. Suddenly, Victoria wasn't just the entitled neighbor with a flat-tired Escalade. She was the subject of a criminal probe. I heard about all of this through Dale, who couldn't stop laughing. "Marcus, you started a domino effect," he said. "That woman poked the wrong man." I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt relieved. The world had a strange way of balancing things when you stood your ground. 2 months later, I got a court summons. Not from her lawyer this time, but from the county. It was for Victoria's criminal trespassing and property destruction charges. I showed up with Jim, every document neatly organized in a binder. Victoria was there too, sitting at the defendant's table, her once perfect hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked smaller, worn down. Her husband wasn't with her. The judge asked if she wanted to contest the charges. Her new lawyer, her third, stood and said they'd reached a plea agreement. She'd plead guilty to trespassing in exchange for reduced charges on property damage. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out everything. The damage to my crops, the loss of livestock, the constant stress. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was loud enough. The judge nodded, reviewed the evidence, and made his ruling. Victoria was ordered to pay me $8,500 in restitution and serve 12 months of probation. She was also forbidden from coming within 500 feet of my property. When the judge read the last part, she finally looked up at me. Her expression was a mix of anger and disbelief, as if the idea of facing consequences had never occurred to her. After court, she left without saying a word. A few weeks later, Dale told me the Paytons had put their house up for sale. The HOA had voted both of them out and hired a forensic accountant to clean up the books. Victoria was now facing separate criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. Rumor was her husband had filed for divorce to protect his assets. By summer, they were gone, house sold, their names stripped from every HOA record. Life on my farm slowly returned to normal. The corn grew tall again. The cattle grazed peacefully, without horns blaring in the distance. I took the restitution money and built a reinforced fence along my western boundary, steel posts, heavy gates, and a new trail camera system. Not because I expected her to come back, but because it felt good to reclaim every inch of what she'd violated. Sometimes I'd find neighbors from Meadowbrook driving by slowly, looking at the fence like it was a monument. In a way, it was. A few months later, I got another letter from the HOA, this time an apology. It was short and formal but sincere. They acknowledged the damage Victoria had caused and thanked me for handling the situation with patience and integrity. I smiled when I read it. Patience and integrity, that's what it had taken. Not revenge, not violence, just a stubborn refusal to let arrogance win. By late summer, the fields were thriving again. Daisy, the cow who'd lost her calf, had recovered and was pregnant once more. One evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset spill gold across the fields. The breeze carried the soft rustle of corn leaves, and for the first time in a long while, everything was exactly as I dreamed it would be when I first bought the land. Peaceful, simple mine. I thought about everything that had happened, the trespassing, the court battles, the lies, and finally, the justice. It amazed me how a single act of entitlement could spiral into so much destruction. Victoria had believed her status, her money, and her position made her untouchable. She thought rules were for other people. But in the end, she'd learned the same lesson every bully learns eventually. When you push hard enough, something pushes back. What struck me most was how close I'd come to losing faith in doing things the right way. There were nights I wanted to retaliate out of anger, to fight fire with fire. But looking back, I was glad I hadn't. I'd stayed calm, documented everything, and fought with facts instead of fists. And when the dust settled, it wasn't me who'd fallen. It was her. Sometimes I still think about that morning when her Escalade sat crippled in my field. Steam rising from the tires, her disbelief turning to rage. It wasn't satisfaction I'd felt then, it was relief. Relief that the madness was finally over. Relief that I didn't have to keep proving my right to what was mine. And maybe a little hope that she'd finally understand what respect meant. If there's one thing I've learned through all this, it's that accountability has a way of finding everyone eventually. You can't cheat it, you can't outrun it, and you definitely can't buy your way out of it. It just takes time and a lot of patience. Now, when I see new neighbors moving into Meadowbrook, I smile and wave. Some wave back, a little awkwardly, like they've heard the stories. Maybe they have. The farmer with the spike strips has become something of a local legend. I don't mind. Legends, after all, are just stories about people who stood their ground when it mattered. I take another sip of my coffee, watching the last of the light fade over the horizon. The cows are calm, the corn sways gently in the breeze, and the gravel road glows silver in the twilight. Somewhere out there, maybe Victoria is still blaming me for what happened. Or maybe, just maybe, she's finally realized that she wasn't the victim. She was the author of her own downfall. Either way, I don't lose sleep over it. The land is quiet again, my fences stand strong, and the only tracks in my field now belong to me.